Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Well, today, considering the spirit of the season and all, we're gonna change gears just a little bit. For all too often, we focus on the sheer grim-dark nature of the 41st millennium, and to be fair, this is the universe that invented things like the demon Kulaba, and even just in the last few months we've talked about, genocide as a virtue with Ortek Moore and his red talents. And if that isn't quite horrible enough, we could always talk about that time a Chaos Saint threw 30,000 Space Marines into hell, where each and every one of them got to experience his own personal purgatory, before having all faith, hope, and belief stripped from him like so much bacon off a fat man's dinner plate. And even if that isn't good enough, well, we did talk about the sword. You know, the sword so dangerous, so powerful that its very existence endangers the entirety of the Imperium of humanity, and the only thing protecting us from aforementioned blade is a patently brain-damaged Grey Knight, simply too stubborn and or stupid to be corrupted. So yeah, the 41st millennium is a damnably undesirable place to have to put up shop, and yet, even in the dark future, there are moments of genuine goodness, one of which we're going to talk about today, namely the bond between the Star Dragons and the blood swords of the God Emperor's adeptus astartes. And speaking of bonds, one last shameless self-plug. The classical role-playing game Rogue Trader, made by the same people behind Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, amongst others, came out just the other week, and it is really damn good. I'm currently playing through it on my secondary channel, where there will be VODs of the first couple episodes and a live stream scheduled for today, presuming I've gotten all of my times right. Unusual enough in and of itself. So, if interested, please do go check it out. And that's enough shameless shilling for one day. The Star Dragons and the Blood Swords. These two chapters are lesser known. In fact, very little concrete is really known about them. But the reason why they are known is a rather uplifting one. Normally, Space Marine chapters are known for remarkable feats of martial prowess, or tragedies suffering extensive casualties in the face of overwhelming odds. Or, on occasion, they'll be famous for significantly darker dalliances, like the Exorcists, for example. But the Star Dragons and the Blood Swords are famous first and foremost for their remarkable friendship with one another. And in a galaxy as blood-soaked as 40k, that is a feature well worth celebrating. But who are these two mysterious chapters precisely, and what is this bond that binds them? Well, a little bit of speculation might be required to explain it all, but that has hardly discouraged me before, now has it? Let us begin with the Star Dragons. It is likely that the Star Dragons are a later founding chapter, as they do not possess the kind of long-term reputation and accolades that the OG chapters do. This too could also simply be explained by the fact that they haven't sought out the spotlight, but it seems a reasonable assumption that they've only emerged in relatively recent 40k history. They are also supposedly an Iron Hand successor chapter, but I do not believe this for even a single solitary second. The Star Dragons have a reputation for, well, honor, decency, and treating both those around them and those who serve them with respect, and even kindness. To the point where many of the chapter's serfs even come to outright worship their officers and commanders. I don't know about you, but generosity, kindness, the ability to get along with others. These do not sound like the traits of your average son of Ferrus Manus. And then there is their heraldry to be considered. a dragon, along with a penchant for enormous lizards, and a particular vocabulary that leads them to referring to their squads as scales, and daily meetings of the chapter's high command as clutches. Finally, at least one amongst their number also likes decorating his armor with the scaled hide of an enormous drake-like creature, apparently native to their home world of Draconith. Now, to be fair, it is entirely possible that all of these little things, their peculiar wording, their symbols, their naming conventions, are all simply just products of their home world, and the presumed native alpha predator serpent thing. It could all just be simple coincidence, and yet it is very hard to deny that the Star Dragons do bear a distinct resemblance to another lizard-affiliated chapter, even more so when their relatively mellow temperament is taken into consideration. And as a final piece of apparent evidence, the Star Dragon's war cry is fire and fury, which does seem to echo that of the salamanders, into the fires of battle, onto the anvil of war. Indeed, the only real indication in the Star Dragon's history and practices that seem to indicate any connection to the Iron Hands whatsoever is their peculiar habit of ritual scarification. Now that in and of itself is hardly rare amongst the ranks of the astartes, and not particularly indicative of the Iron Hands, but the Star Dragons further amplify this process by embedding electrocircuitry into the scar tissue and into the wounds themselves. These will then form intricate patterns glowing with a bluish hue. This gives the Star Dragons an appearance that has been described as akin to a caged star. Again, this is certainly a far cry from the mass, voluntary, and desirable augmentization of the Iron Hands, but it is at least a nod in their general direction. But all in all, I would quite confidently say that the Star Dragon's gene seed could be far more likely traced to Nocturne than to Medusa. Beyond this, however, not a whole lot is known about the chapter. They appear to be largely Codex compliant, organizing themselves and their general indicative iconography, things like company markings, for example, along the lines of the Codex Astartes. The only other truly noteworthy and immediately apparent feature of the Star Dragons is that they possess apparently a rather complicated relationship with the Ordo Malus of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. The Ordo Malus, of course, is the branch of the Inquisition that is specialized in dealing with the servants of the warp and the ruinous powers. Now, of course, it is far from unusual for Inquisitors to enlist the aid of Astartes chapters, should whatever objective they are currently pursuing prove worthy of the Space Marines' martial prowess. But there is one incident that has to do with a space hulk, the accursed Eternity, which we will probably return to later, which seems to suggest that the Star Dragons have a bit of history with the Ordo Malus, as despite being quite hesitant of accepting the Inquisitor's mission, they felt honor-bound to do so anyways. Any speculation as to the reason why would, well, remain pure speculation, as there isn't really enough to go on. There are countless reasons why a Space Marine chapter might consider itself indebted to the Inquisition. Perhaps the chapter had previously made some sort of commitment to them, or perhaps the Inquisition had overlooked some impropriety in return for later favours, or perhaps the Star Dragons simply felt that it was their civic duty, shall we say, to assist in whatever way possible, as they do certainly seem to be good guy Marines. But let us now move on to the second chapter, the Blood Swords, a chapter whose heritage is far more readily discernible. The Blood Swords are another, later founding chapter, probably created in the same founding as the Star Dragons, and likely a founding specifically designed to deal with increased activity coming out of the Eye of Terror, as both chapters, of course, are located in the Segmentum Obscurus, an area that has seen several foundings created specifically to guard against incursions coming out of the Great Eye. Furthermore, the Blood Swords' homeworld of Jaggerfall is very close to the Star Dragon's homeworld of Draconith, suggesting that both were created as a way to strengthen the defenses around the Eye and counteract Chaos raiding activity. This also, of course, means that the chapter would have been heavily involved with dealing with the occasional fallout of, warp activity in and around the systems that they have been assigned to. In fact, one of these instances is the earliest recorded mention of the Blood Swords, the purging of the Inando system in 845 Millennia 41. When the Blood Swords chapter participated in a campaign against the Inado system, presumably alongside other Imperial and Inquisitorial forces, though the details of this campaign has since been lost to history, or been deliberately misplaced, as the end result of the campaign was well over 100 billion Imperial citizens dead after the ultimate sanction of exterminatus was carried out. Considering the frequent and close cooperation between the Blood Swords and the Star Dragons, this might also conceivably be where the Star Dragons gained their debt to the Ordo Malus. Perhaps they elected to escort some transport ships of civilians out of the exterminator zone before the ultimate sanction was passed down. Perhaps the Inquisition elected to simply overlook this misguided act of mercy and thus gain the Star Dragon's fealty. It's possible, but at the same time, there are a lot of purging campaigns going on in the vicinity of the Eye of Terror. So this campaign, where 100 billion civilians lost their lives, well, it's really nothing all that special or noteworthy in the grand scheme of things. Although it does indicate that the Blood Swords have a reputation for fierce loyalty, as the Inquisition tends to only use those Astartes chapters whose fealty and understanding of the hard necessities and realities of the Imperium can be relied upon to carry out such strident missions, as there have been plenty of occasions where the Inquisition has damn near ended up in outright warfare with Astartes chapters when their allies have been chosen poorly. Besides this potential inquisitorial favour, very little else is known about the Blood Swords, except that they are presumably a Codex-compliant chapter, and that they have had unusual leadership for quite some time. Now, of course, the chapter master of a chapter is usually amongst its eldest and most respected individuals, but very rarely indeed, if ever in the entire history of the Imperium has a chapter been commanded by someone quite so ancient as the Blood Swords, as their chapter master for quite some time was the venerable dreadnought Dagon. This is most unorthodox, and also raises some interesting questions about the chapter as well. See, usually the chapter master of a chapter needs to be around all the time, and usually dreadnoughts aren't. Due to the strain placed upon the mutilated body within the dreadnought casket, most dreadnoughts, in fact 99.9%, are allowed to while away the centuries in deep sleep aboard their chapter's warships, and to not do so would probably lead to madness at best and outright homicidal insanity at worst. And yet Dagon not only managed to retain enough wisdom, intellect, and calm cunning to lead the chapter, he maintained it for centuries, as he was interned within the dreadnought before being elevated to the position of chapter master. Now, a chapter master being placed within a dreadnought and continuing to serve in that capacity would perhaps be more understandable, a way of honoring him and continuing his rule until he himself voluntarily gave it up, or perhaps transforming it into an honorary title. But for a dreadnought to be elevated to the position, I think this may very well be a unique situation in the entirety of 40k. As again, it is very difficult to overstate the strain and the burden placed upon the venerable pilot of a dreadnought. For Dagon to retain his faculties to this degree will have required a will of spun steel. Which also, incidentally, as mentioned, does raise some questions as to the chapter's heritage. The Blood Swords are supposedly a successor chapter of the Blood Angels, and their actions and history, particularly during the devastation of Baal, seems to reinforce this obvious notion. And yet, we know, of course, that the Blood Angels are afflicted with the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, seemingly near inescapable consequences of their gene seed and its connection to their sire, Sanguinius. It is the near inescapable fate of every Blood Angel to either die honorably in combat or to be subsumed by this gene curse. There are exceptions, of course, as with every rule. Mephiston, the chief librarian of the Blood Angels, or Lord Commander Dante, their chapter master. But these exceptions are beyond rare. And for a venerable dreadnought to not only retain his faculties, despite centuries interned within a dreadnought's tomb, but also avoid falling to the rage whilst in the form of a near constantly awoken dreadnought, that stretches credulity. And there have been certain whispers that mayhaps the Blood Swords, although generally accepted within the fraternity of the Blood Angels, might not necessarily belong amongst their ranks, suggesting mayhaps even a darker origins. And we do know that certain other chapters, ostensibly connected to the Blood Angels, a certain sticky-fingered one, for example, have been strongly suspected of quite different parentage. Still, the simple fact that aforementioned Chapter Master Dagon died in the defense of Sanguinius's very tomb on Baal, alongside brethren, blood angels, well, that in and of itself is enough to grant him the title of Son of Sanguinius, at least in my opinion. But we haven't even yet gotten to the Blood Swords fraternity and relationship with the Star Dragons. So let's get started on that, shall we? Much like the two chapters themselves, their cooperative actions are unknown for the most part. But what is absolutely known is that the Star Dragons and the Blood Swords, in large parts due to the relative proximity of their homeworlds, often operated cooperatively and together, both in full chapter strength and as individual detachment. Blood Swords would be attached to Star Dragon operations, and vice versa. The two chapters' fleets would operate in mutual support of one another. They would lend one another resources, shelter, and aid whenever required. In fact, the two operated so closely that I imagine there were more than a few Inquisitors sniffing around for that very reason, wondering if this sort of a unified or near unified command structure that communicated frequently could not potentially prove to be a little dangerous. Now, of course, groups of Space Marines working together is not uncommon, and it is certainly not unsanctioned either, but it does have a bit of an unfortunate history. See the Wardens of the Maelstrom for further examples of that. But I do also want to emphasize that this bond was beyond merely two chapters using one another for additional force, for additional ships or brother marines. It struck far deeper than that. Through their continued and mutual cooperation, they developed genuine fraternity between one another, the likes of which usually only reserved for battle brothers within the same chapter. Which is also interesting, as normally the sons of Sanguinius and those of Vulcan, well, whilst both noble chapters, their temperaments, again, might not go along with one another quite so well. Though, depending upon the speculations as to both chapters' actual heritage, that too could go both ways. Iron Hands operating hand in hands with, I don't know, certain sorceress prodigies, perhaps? That would be an interesting project, and no doubt about it. But speculation surrounding parentage notwithstanding, the two chapters formed friendships, true and honest friendships, based on mutual respect and honor. And they went well beyond the usual lines of brotherly duty as well. The Blood Swords, you see, lost control of their homeworld of Jaggerfall. Exactly what happened to it is unclear. Now, there are quite a few reasons why a chapter might lose their homeworld. A taint may have been discovered, and the chapter itself may have divested itself from the world to avoid such a taint. The Inquisition may have come calling and simply confiscated it. Both are hardly unknown things this near to the Eye of Terror. There is also the potential that, Chapter Master Dagon was wounded, supposedly, by a Tyranid spore mind, and that was what saw him interned within his dreadnought body. A lengthy war against those monsters, that would readily explain the disappearance of quite a few worlds. And the Blood Swords would not be the only Space Marine chapter to have been driven from their home planets by the ever-expanding and ever-greedy jaws of the Hive fleets. Regardless of how it happened, however, the Blood Swords obviously took it very, very badly. This was a planet that had been entrusted into their care by, in essence, the God Emperor himself, via the Imperium. This was their world to protect, more so than any other. And so the Blood Swords elected to take upon themselves a Penitent Crusade. Now, I want to be quite clear as well that this was probably a self-imposed punishment, which is why I worded it as I did. Penitent Crusades are not simply ways of punishments. They are not always something hoisted upon chapters without their approval or their agreement. Sometimes it is punishment, sometimes the chapter does not have a choice. Sometimes the chapter goes willingly, and sometimes the chapter chooses to undergo a Penitent Crusade to rectify some error, some failing, either of spirit or of body, to make amends in essence for some grave misdeed. And in the case of the Blood Swords, the reason for it is obvious: the loss of their home world. And it is also a partial Penitent Crusade, as normally the entire chapter embarks upon it, and they forbid themselves from recruiting any replacement Marines until the crusade is done. Now, whether or not the Blood Swords has imposed this restriction upon themselves is unclear, but it appears as if only a portion of the chapter is currently undergoing the crusade, and that this is a revolving duty, where presumably companies or maybe ships will switch off on the duty of joining Containment Fleet Kappa, which is the official designation given to the Penitent Crusade, patrolling the outskirts of the Eye of Terror. Another potential interpretation is that only a portion of the chapter is dedicated to it, because the other half is made up of star dragons. Now, again, to make it absolutely clear here, there were no bonds of commitment between the Star Dragons and the Blood Swords. The Star Dragons hadn't signed a contract or promise that in the unlikely circumstance of one or the other undertaking a Penitent Crusade that the other was obligated to join. The Star Dragons simply volunteered themselves to do so, without any demands, without any strings attached. They simply joined in. And it might then be that this was a form of argument. All right, brothers, we understand that you feel you have failed, but we think the galaxy are better off with you, and so allow us to share a part of your burden. Something like that. Purely speculative, mind you, but it sounds good, doesn't it? And it would probably be within character for the Star Dragons. But, yet again, I must unfortunately disappoint you by also now saying that not a lot is known about this buddy cop comedy either. Which is a damn shame, because this is a really interesting part of lore that probably deserves a bit of exploration. A moment of light in the dark that does not actually defy the dark. See, I do have a lot of complaints about the direction that modern-day 40k is going in that it is making the world far too bright and hopeful again. There is a way to have good, honorable, and uplifting stories without actually making the world any less grim and any less dark. Bringing back goddamn loyalist primarchs and launching galaxy-spanning crusades, reforging the legions, in essence, is not one of them. But we do have one exploit at least we can celebrate. The attack and the eventual destruction, or possibly just the driving off, of the Space Hulk, the Accursed Eternity. Now, space hulks, of course, can vary tremendously in the threat that they pose to the Imperium. Some are simply just masses of steel and various ships fused together by the vagaries of the warp, no more dangerous than any planet-sized chunk of metal spiraling through the galaxy. Others might be home to enormous armies of orcs or tyrannids, or darker things still. Others might be so poisoned by the warp that their mere presence and existence is a danger to any nearby world. Again, see the Badab series for more on that. The accursed eternity, however, appeared at first to be the first, and none of the latter. It appeared to be a drifting hulk. It did come with a little bit of a chaos escort, however, which was engaged by Ordo Malus agents of the Inquisition, and fleet ships probably gathered from Imperial Navy elements nearby. This inquisitorial flotilla demanded the aid of nearby Astartes forces, which just happened to be Containment Fleet Kappa, and its consignment of blood swords and star dragons. After driving off the Chaos warships, the Ordo Malus Inquisitor informed the Space Marines that he would require an escort so that he may venture into the depths of the accursed eternity. The Marines were hesitant to allow this, as they would much rather simply destroy it from range with their weaponry, but due again to the unspoken debt, perhaps, that the Star Dragons owed the Ordo Malus, it was agreed that he would be granted 3 squads, 2 from the Star Dragons and 1 from the Blood Swords. As they entered the Space Hulk, it appeared to be largely relatively inert, a little bit of warp fuckery notwithstanding. And eventually the warriors and their charge found the central chamber of the Space Hulk, where the Ordo Malus Inquisitor revealed that the entity that had been trapped, or who had trapped itself, who had embodied this enormous hulk, was none other than one of Tzeentch's most favored servants, Kairos Fate Weaver, also known as the Architect of Fate. Having come prepared to deal explicitly with this threat, the Ordo Malus agent produced a book, inscribed with a prayer to the God Emperor intended to banish Kairos back to the warp forever. And it would have worked. But the entity was not Kairos Fate Weaver. It was a far bloodier, brutal, and darker entity that had been entrapped within the accursed eternity specifically as a trap for the Inquisitor. His prayer useless, his power worthless, the Inquisitor was the first to die. And standing now against an entire demon-possessed space hulk, the Marines were faced with no choice but to flee for their lives back to their vessels, which they did. Suffering tremendous casualties, they did eventually manage to escape back aboard their vessels and order the annihilation of the Space Hulk. The Marine warships opened up immediately and succeeded in, at least, banishing it. Although the quantity of wreckage left behind was sparse. And if one was to be a pessimist, one might very well suggest that the accursed eternity had done exactly what it was intended to do, killing precisely who it meant to, and sparing precisely who it meant to, before moving on with its master's plans. At least, as another bright spot in the darkness, the Blood Swords and the Star Dragons had both managed to live to fight another day. Which points back to my previous point as well, about it being entirely possible to have light in the darkness, without it overpowering the darkness. I would like to see more of the relationship between these two brother chapters, though, as it is a really cool and unusual story. But until next time, that is all we know about either one of these chapters, so I have been Arch, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.